proud to introduce the panel here on finding grid-scale solar best practices. And here's our panelists and our moderator. Our moderator is Nicholas Muller. Nicholas is an associate professor and Lester and Judith Lave Chair of Economics, Engineering, and Public Policy. Muller's current work focuses on comparing air pollution and climate damages from electric vehicles to conventional vehicles, estimating air pollution damage from energy production, an ex-post evaluation of the asset rain program, quality change in energy price indices, and selection bias in air pollution monitoring networks. Please welcome Nicholas. Next, we have Chanel Mayer. Chanel is a respected renewable energy developer recognized for strategic positioning and innovative solutions. Before her current role at NextEra Energy Resources, she served as Director of Energy Optimization at Universal Management Solutions. At NextEra, Chanel leads the renewable energy development of a large pipeline of solar and battery storage projects located across Pennsylvania. We also have Emily Wingerman. Emily brings a broad range of industry experience to Lightsource BP with expertise in power markets, energy policy, and generation and electric system operations, which is complemented by her background in technology. Emily oversees business development. Next, we have Mandy LeBrier. Mandy serves as the City of Chicago and functions as the Chief Energy Officer, advising the Deputy Commissioner of Energy Procurement and Management in the Department of Fleet and Facility Management. She directs energy procurement operations and Bureau Strategic Planning. Next, we have Adam Agalico. Adam is the Energy Manager for the City of Philadelphia. In his role, he manages a team responsible for tracking city government energy use, developing and implementing energy conservation, energy efficiency, and renewable energy projects for facilities, and providing strategic procurement of city government's energy supply. Finally, we have Krisha Kubiak. Krisha is Director of State Regulatory Strategy and Government Affairs at Duquesne Light here in Pittsburgh. Krisha has worked at Duquesne Light for over 12 years with a focus on energy law and policy. Her department works on policy issues including solar, microgrids, electric vehicle policy, and sustainability. Please welcome our panel.
Thanks very much for coming, and this should be a really informative panel. I wanted to start with a question that relates to the components of a typical installation, a typical project, and ask what are some of the components of what typically makes a successful project. Chanel, would you like to get us started?
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to take a quick minute also to thank Anna Siefkin and her team for putting on such an inspirational event. We at NextEra are very excited to be participating. Events like this can really be the thin edge of the wedge for energy innovation in a region. And it's clear that the Scott Institute and some of the other parties that are here this week are driving that forward here. So it's great to see, and my hat goes off to you, Anna. So to answer the question, there are many considerations that an experienced developer takes into account when developing universal scale projects. If I went into all of them, we'd probably be here for a few months. So for the purposes of today's panel, I will boil them down to 4 big ones. So the first is resource. So at NextEra, we have an internal group called NextEra Analytics. They're data, resource, and atmospheric scientists. And one of the things they do for us is they measure resource in an area that we're interested in for a few years prior to investment. So in Pennsylvania, you have a solar radiance resource of about 25%. In the desert Southwest states, to give you guys some context, you would see anywhere from 30 to 35%. So I think sometimes people are surprised that the delta there, the difference is really not that big. The second is access to transmission. So this is how we deliver the electricity that our projects generate to our customers. The third is available land. So we'll do a land scan in an area, and we'll make sure we're avoiding conservation areas as well as hilly areas. With grid scale solar, really the flatter the better. And then we'll enter long-term agreements with landowners. So these long-term partnerships are really a great opportunity for Western Pennsylvanian families to diversify their income and take advantage of a long-term income stream of 30 to 40 years. So especially like if you're a farmer and you own a lot of land, a lot of times our long-term leases can be the difference that will help keep the farm in the family for generations to come. And then the fourth is the customer. So we utilize PPAs or power purchase agreements with our customers. And it's never been a better time to be a customer of renewable energy. So traditionally, you'd think of a customer as a utility, but solar has come down 80% in cost in the last decade, according to SEIA. And with the advent of storage, it becomes even more attractive and is now cost competitive with all new forms of energy generation. So it's smart, it's good for the country, it's sustainable, it's clean, it increases resiliency, and it creates economic opportunity in rural, sometimes economically depressed, and post-industrial areas. So we were working just with utilities, now we still do, but also companies like Google, AT&T, Facebook. AT&T, we just signed the largest renewable PPA of 820 megawatts. And municipalities like City of Pittsburgh, universities, just like CMU and others. So there's a lot more diversity in the market now, and the time has never been better to invest in universal scale solar.
Excellent. Thanks, Janelle. Other panelists on what makes or comprises a successful installation?
Sure. This is Emily Wangerman from Lightsource BP. I am not going to go into the extensive list because Chanel already covered it, but I would say the things that were not covered, number one, obviously, I would say from our perspective is the customer. So what does the customer really want? Does that customer want a product that is available, for instance, on the storage side, which can provide peak shaving or can flex to address a different time period when there's high energy use? On the solar side, what does the customer want? Do they want a firm product? So do they want a product that's available 24/7? Well, we can do some sort of unique product on that side where you can combine different technologies. But overall, on the resource side as a development, really what it comes down to is, did you pick the right site? So going back to what she's talking about, is the land actually good for development for solar? Is there capacity on the lines? And overall, is it something that the local township and people actually want? And I think that's a key part on the politics side is, does the community really want this resource? And being part of that community and giving back to them, is that valuable to them, and making sure that they're valuing it? And obviously on the other side is just overall on the politics side, Pennsylvania in particular is a really growing market for solar in particular. It's a great opportunity to get engaged now, particularly with recent regulatory changes that incent in-state solar generation. So I think that's one that's a major driver that's going to continue to influence overall renewables, is just overall policy components. So I'd say the one big one that wasn't mentioned by Chanel is the policy dynamics, and as they change both on the national scale as well as on the state and local scale.
Excellent. So we're going to dig into policy forces in just a moment, but on successful installations,
Let me
Tricia?
just say a good point, and as we are comparing it to rooftop solar, is from a utility perspective. The utility is charged with making sure that you have the same voltage. We have rules around the fact that your voltage has to be consistent and within a certain range. When you go to rooftop solar, there's a lot of voltage changes that go along with this. So this is separate from the energy side, but there's a lot of voltage variation. And the more penetration you have on rooftop, the higher those voltage changes happen. So when these kind of large-scale systems end up on the transmission system, all of that voltage change is taken care of through the substations that lead to your house. So there's no input on that. The other benefit that we have, especially here in Pennsylvania, within the PJM RTO, is the fact that PJM can see and model all of this solar. So once they know it's there, they can not call the coal-fired plant on a day that they know that they're going to get a lot of solar input, as opposed to the solar on your house, which they're not necessarily going to model to the same sense. I'm not saying they don't model at all, but they have much more control over the solar on the transmission side. So it's another benefit both for the environment and for the grid.
Excellent. Andy or Adam?
I think we talked a little bit about the customer, and I just think it's important to have customers that are progressive and interested in this work. And I know that there's companies out there like Nextera and DPP Lightsource that are out there developing these projects, and they're waiting for the customers. So to some extent, if somebody like, I'm representing the city of Philadelphia, we went out and are doing a 70 megawatt power purchase agreement right now for an in-state solar project. We know that there was dozens of other projects we could have chose from, and so that I just think that there's a real need to sort of develop the customer end and make sure that those folks are really ready and eager and understand how they can integrate large amounts of renewable energy into their load and into their purchasing program. So it's not just a kind of transaction, it's more of a strategy.
Thanks for that perspective. Andy?
Yeah, so what makes a successful project for grid-scale solar? I think that what you're hearing is everybody's perspective, and it depends on, the seat that you're in. And for the city of Chicago, it's a little different. I'm going to give you what my commissioner would say. He would say it's the structure of the deal. And so the deal is important. A good deal is something that benefits everybody in the audience, the light company, the city, the customers, and that also benefits the city of Chicago. So it's absolutely the structure of the deal. How much you're going to pay for kilowatt per hour, the geographic location of the systems, certainly all the technical and analytical components are important to creating grid-scale solar, but it's really the structure of the deal at the end of the day that's going to be important to community stakeholders, to public sector stakeholders, to utility stakeholders, and everybody in the room.
Great. Thank you very much. Part of what came up in this discussion that I'm hearing is the importance of both federal and state policies. If each of you could just take a moment and talk about how perhaps one of the many policies out there that's relevant affect your organization's decision-making processes, that would be great. Emily, do you want to start?
Sure. So in the solar world, I'd say the two biggest are around, so there's generally the renewable portfolio standards that are set based on states, and those are not federal, but those are the state level ones that vary based on each state, and more specifically, they'll vary based on their targets as well as the carve-outs for solar. And then on the federal level, the biggest one is the investment tax credit. And so on the investment tax credit, I'll talk a little bit more about that one because I think it's the most applicable federal one for solar. This is a tax incentive so the way that solar, utility scale solar is built is a little different than what you'd think about when you're building it on your rooftop, for instance. So on the utility side, the people that actually spend the money in the capital intensive part are actually the developers. So the customer is really paying for it on a typical kind of think of it like your electricity bill. And so they're not having to put down the big capital costs. The people that actually put that capital cost on is actually people that are actually making the investment on it. And so you have these people that have an opportunity to defer taxes, and so that's where this investment tax credit comes from. And so they're incented to participate in investing in solar because they can defer their taxes. Now, the reason why this is an important part is because it's a huge way that we actually finance our projects. And that process, or that incentive coming from the federal government, is stepping down starting in 2020, and it steps down 4%. And so that is really important, and that means that right now the market is really trying to address that, and obviously there's some real benefits because of the amount of solar that's going in that we're able to kind of ride some of that out, but it will make a difference in rates.
Others?
So I agree. The ITC is, of course, a big value add for developers right now. I would just add that the future is still very bright for solar, and post-ITC phase-out, we would still expect to see solar investment and build-out grow over time.
Christian?
I would just make the point that sometimes it's when we start comparing different states. So I hear often, hey, they're doing this in California. And we are restricted by the fact that we are in Pennsylvania, plus we are within PJM. And so what we try and keep in mind is, one, is because we are not a vertically integrated state. What does that mean for utilities? It means that you can buy your power from anyone. You do not have to purchase it from us. In California, you have to buy it from your utility company. So the PUC allows them to build solar. We are not allowed to build solar. And that's great for the market. It's also great for you as a consumer, because you can actually buy grid scale utilities solar right now. You can go onto papowerswitch.com and you can purchase 100% renewable product for your own use. Is not something you can do in every state. Other states, you are locked into purchasing the electric power that comes from the coal-fired generation plants that the utility owns. So it's part of how both PJM and Pennsylvania state rules affect the grid scale solar.
Go ahead, Mandy.
Yeah, you're right. It does depend on state-to-state perspective. So in Illinois, we're a wholesale deregulated market, and so whether you're C&I, public sector, residential, you have a choice in your supplier. So you can select whoever and whatever type of generation you want to purchase. And what that does is it incentivizes individuals who are engaged in sustainability initiatives to make that market choice to move solar or wind or other renewable sources forward. Having that flexibility in a regulatory environment is incredibly helpful. Additionally, Illinois passed precedent-setting legislation in 2016, became effective in 2017. It was called the Future Energy Jobs Act, also known as the Exelon Bill. And so that the Exelon side was another story of the bill, but what we like to talk about in Chicago is that it advanced the state of Illinois' renewable portfolio standard, and by doing so, it's requiring the utilities to implement more grid-scale solar in Illinois. And we're not the sunniest state in the union, so that makes things a little challenging, but we are making effective operational changes to our grid that are going to benefit the customers as a whole.
Adam, thoughts on federal or state policy?
Just want to jump on what Manny was saying, which is, right now in Pennsylvania, there's proposed legislation for renewable or alternative energy portfolio standard reform, as well as nuclear zero emission credit compensation. I'm not going to politicize it too much, but these are active conversations that are happening in the legislature. This is the first time in Pennsylvania that these conversations have happened in probably 10 years or so. So it really is an interesting time in Pennsylvania. In the next 6 to 9 months, I think, are going to tell sort of what happens in terms of whether there's an additional alternative energy portfolio standard with a solar carve-out, which would make kind of the assets that we're buying into and the projects that they're developed, all the more valuable. And really, but more importantly for the city and the state is kind of looking at carbon emissions. This is a single. Electricity use is one of the largest uses of carbon emissions, as we all know. So this is the opportunity to kind of adjust that into the next 10, 15 years. And then we may not have another opportunity like this for a little while. So call your legislature.
Yeah, I want to drive that home if I can, because, number one, get out and vote, right? I mean, that's key in this. But I also encourage you to look at the Energy Institute Administration. The EIA, they issued a report last week that talked about in the last 10 years, so from 2008 to 2018, renewables have doubled. And so I believe it was, you'll have to check the graph and double check me, but I want to say it was 2 million megawatt hours of solar were available in 2008, and in 2018 it was 96 million megawatt hours. So if that gives you some kind of perspective on the drive of what the voter has with respect to developing that assets, because it's market driven, you all are the ones who are making the choices in what you want to buy, and renewable is getting cheaper.
So this has been an interesting discussion about federal and state policies, but one thing that hasn't really come up explicitly is this idea that there are municipal level policy forcers as well that influence decision making. I wonder if we could start with either Mandy or Adam, who are representing municipalities, and then open that up to the panel.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So the city of Philadelphia has a goal for its own assets of 100% renewable electricity by 2030. We set that goal after a lot of thinking and a lot of looking at kind of how can we adjust our carbon emissions as a city, citywide. And we kind of determined more or less that for us to meet our long-term goals of 2050, not a carbon neutral, but a 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, we need to have a almost exclusively zero carbon grid by 2050. This is kind of big and out there, and we sort of said, well, if we're going to say that in 2050 we need a zero carbon grid, what can the city do to kind of spur that investment and spur that along? And the best and the most easiest lever that we have as a city, as an institution, is our own purchasing power. And said, all right, well, let's get out in front of this and say by 2030 we'll have ourselves at 100% renewable electricity, knowing that will drive investment. And that seems like the city's a big entity, but we're 5% of citywide load in the city of Philadelphia. So if you think of large institutions and large kind of buyers at their option deciding to go forward and buy renewable electricity, you really can start to move the grid. If you look at the biggest users in the city of Philadelphia, and similarly here in Pittsburgh, if you look at the largest users, the institutions and the customers that are out there, you can get to 15, 20% maybe renewable electricity from those entities just by their choice. So that's the lever that we feel like we have, and the reasoning behind it is just really it's climate policy, and in the absence of state or federal leadership on these issues, these are things we can do. I should also say that all of these things are happening under the guise of economics, so it's not that we're just going out and writing a blank check. These projects have to work for us, and they do work for us, or at least our initial project does work for us from an economic perspective, where we feel like there's a net positive cash flow to the city by investing in this.
Thank you. Mandy?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It is the power of the purse for sure. Just to give you some context, so when I started with the city in 2016, our annual energy budget was $148 million. And so it's a combination of two things. We've reduced that over the last couple of years to 137 is where we landed last year. And we've done that by obviously energy efficiency initiatives and building performance improvements in the city's facilities. But also we hedge all of our portfolio. And so being able to make those market choices in the future at lower prices provides us opportunity that not other municipal governments have. And not every municipal government is purchasing the load that we are, and also the cost that we are. And so we recognize that it's important to reduce that cost, because ultimately the people in the room are paying for it. I mean, the taxpayers are paying for it. We have a taxpayer operating budget. So we have to make smart investment driven decisions that are also sustainable. And it's the balance of both of those that create the complexity for my seat. At the same time, it's not Duquesne Light, it's another utility for me, but they're in the room saying, hey, we're in it to make money. So, how do we structure the deal that is right for everybody in the room?
Great.
Can I add one more thing?
Please do, and then Christian.
You mentioned the hedge strategy, and I think it's important to think of it both from a portfolio perspective, your electricity purchasing, but also thinking of investment in renewable energy in some ways as a policy hedge. In the next 15, 20 years, I think that there could be a federal policy that puts a tax on carbon or does some sort of large cost that we're not currently carrying right now in our economic system. We're purchasing 22% of our electricity through the project we're doing. We know that at least a portion of that is shielded from any future kind of carbon costs down the road.
Yeah, and for us, it's 5 years. I mean, we're going to 100% by 2025, or at least that's the goal that the administration announced, and then they told everybody in the city figure out how to do it. So we're working on it, and it's definitely an undertaking, but hopefully federal legislation will follow that will make things more economically feasible.
Thank you. Grisha, you wanted to say something?
Just say from a local perspective, we also are cognizant of the fact there's 138 municipalities in Allegheny County. So even if the city of Pittsburgh is on board, there's lots of other people. And in talking, especially to other utilities who have more solar expansion than we do currently, there is a lot of pushback to utility scale solar because people don't like seeing it. They don't like seeing infrastructure, be it transmission lines or poles, and I think solar panels look very pretty, but clearly I'm not the only one. So involving yourself in your local municipality and making sure that they don't affect zoning laws that could impact cutting out renewables is a really important piece that people can do.
Thanks very much. So we've been talking about policies, and many of those policies would influence the question I'm going to ask next, like the ITC, but I wonder if we could have a discussion about some of the investment risks that are associated with siting different projects.
Sure. So local permitting is a risk that we run into as developers. So one of the things that's very important at NextEra, we are in 36 states and 4 Canadian provinces. So there's a lot of collaboration amongst the team. Renewables are regional, so there's a lot of lessons learned that's shared amongst everyone. And really immersing yourself in the community, figuring out what they want, and yeah.
Some of the local contexts. Emily?
Yeah, I'd agree with Chanel. It's definitely about the local permitting, and so you look at a couple things. You'll look at how does the land have any risk of species, for instance? So you would basically carve out that land. You don't want to take that risk. Same with wetlands, and obviously that changes over time, and whether or not climate change is human caused, either way it is happening. And so with the changes with weather patterns and the changes increased amount of water, that just changes what is wetlands, and so you have to account for that. And then obviously any sort of major regulatory change could be impactful. If tomorrow something on the federal level decided there were no renewables, or it became much more challenging to develop, then that would change the dynamics. I would say at this point in time, the good news is people are making decisions, like each person's talked about here, making decisions on economics. It's not about sustainability. I mean, the sustainability is the benefit, but really it's about the fact that solar and wind as well are lower cost. And so they're making decisions economically, which tends to be the ones that stick.
Andy?
Yeah, it's who takes on that risk is really, I think, the most important part of the conversation. I mean, we issued an RFP this past year to develop 7 vacant land properties that the city owns that are brownfields. And so there's an environmental component to that. And who's going to take on the cost of that cleanup is a lot of the conversation that we have to have with the stakeholders in the room. They want to see that grid scale development, but there's also some changes that have to take place within the environment before those projects can be implemented, and that's costly. So it's balancing that with the entities that are developing the projects.
Adam, thoughts?
I think they covered it pretty well.
Very good. So another key question that would be interesting to discuss is what are some of the factors that drive whether on-site or off-site installations make sense, and how have those factors changed over time?
Go ahead.
Sure. I'll be the guinea pig. No, so I would say that the biggest difference is there land available, right? So on-site is a great option because the land, just like my colleague was just mentioning, if you have land available, then that can be a good opportunity to use that land for something, frankly, that commercial other uses is often not possible. So solar can be put pretty much anywhere. So that's helpful. And then the other big decision between going on-site versus off-site is economics and scale. And so if you go larger, you're going to get better economics just due to economies of scale. And you're obviously going to be, therefore, able to impact more GHG reduction and things like that. So it's really about, is the land available? How much does it cost? How much does it cost to clean up? So if you're going for a green field, so if it's traditionally being used for instance, farming, it's a lot easier to develop on that site versus something like a brown field, which requires a lot of cleanup and requires more risk. And so if you're purely making decisions based on economics, it's easier and more affordable to go off-site on a green field.
Others? Go ahead, Chanel.
So I think it depends on the customer's needs and their energy usage, also land availability, as Emily pointed out. But for large customers, it might be a combination of both DG and universal or grid scale solar. That would be the best option for them. So at NextEra, we have both DG and universal solutions available, and there can be cost benefits with procuring both. So that might be something to consider if you have a load that's large enough.
From the municipal perspective, on-site, off-site?
I'll just say that the transaction cost is really important. So, doing one large, big project versus trying to site a number of smaller projects in a dense urban environment, just the transaction costs are tremendous when you try to think of, okay, we've got to figure out the availability of these roofs and whether they can structurally handle it, whether we've got other land, whether that land has got better future uses in other places and other benefits. And for us, one of the big things was just saying, well, we could invest in clean energy on in our own sites, on our own buildings, but it's going to take a heck of a lot more effort to vet all of those unknowns versus going out and having a developer find a site that's relatively more of a greenfield and get that scale of investment in a lot larger perspective.
Adam, where is your project?
It's near Gettysburg. It's about 2.5 hours from Philadelphia. We're working to have local, both Adams County folks as well as Philadelphians work on the project as well.
And are you getting any pushback for turning a green field into a solar?
Yes, but I shouldn't say we are, with the developers working through those issues. So.
I think to answer that or to address that, so we also have a lot of projects around where Adams projects are located. We just signed a 25-year PPA with Penn State, so that's probably people may have heard of that. So I would say that it's really important to talk to the local entities and the local community and make sure that they are comfortable with it. But actually, from our perspective, our community has been quite supportive, because not only are we taking the land and basically leaving it for 35, 40 years, it's actually increasing the land biodiversity. And so we're also working on projects where there's co-location of agriculture, as well as we do bee apiaries. Lightsource has our own honey. So it's, I think there's a lot of advantages to come out and show up well with the community, and it's actually a positive impact. And so I think it's just about being smart with working with your customers and working with your developer.
Thanks very much. So I thought we might transition now to a stage in which we're taking some of the questions from the audience, which I've got loaded up here. One that I'm looking at that perhaps might be interesting is asking what decision-making or planning is involved when grid-scale solar comes offline or when panels reach the end of their useful life. Mandy?
My perspective is probably slightly different than the developer's perspective. So we've talked about that and about what recycling or the afterlife of panels looks like, or potentially just the transition to new tech in the same location. So that's something that everyone is still trying to figure out as we work through this process.
So at the end of its useful life, we'll decommission the site and return the property to its former or better condition.
I should just mention, we talked a little bit about land issues and letting farmland, in our case, the project we've been working with, letting that kind of lay fallow for 20 years and is actually a benefit, and that was one of the things that folks were excited about it. So while there is some folks that are maybe not as excited about the project for different reasons, the landowners are actually really supportive for that reason, because it's farmland that's just been used for hundreds of years and needs a break. So,
Makes sense. Another one from the audience. As extreme weather or severe weather conditions become more common, how is this affecting the development process in grid-scale solar, and how do you anticipate that might change in the future?
So I'll take this one. We have some experience in this in Florida. So FPL, our sister company, is deploying a lot of grid-scale solar across the state, and they have held up, the plants have held up incredibly well thus far. So I think we're very hopeful that our sites can handle the largest storms.
Others on that topic?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we have a large portfolio of operating assets that has been able to weather a lot of storms. I think solar is actually pretty hardy. We don't have a ton of moving parts. We don't have fuel source requirements. Our sun is the fuel source. And so that's really helpful. And so we don't get into issues that have been seen, for instance, in the East Coast recently with fuel availability constraints. As pipelines become constrained with natural gas or coal being able to ship in, those aren't our problems. We still have the sun. So I would say in general, solar is pretty resilient, and it also helps with resiliency risk in regional areas. So if you have a resource that's close by to load, it really helps relieve some of that constraint. So overall, I think it's only a good thing to have it.
Appreciate it.
Just comment that we have family in Puerto Rico, so we were down there. People on the DG side are installing removable solar panels so that when the hurricane's coming, they actually pull them inside into their house and keep them safe during the storms.
Interesting. Here we have one for Adam. Adam mentioned pushback from the community regarding a greenfield solar project. And the audience member just wonders, what are the sticking points, and is there something an energy manager can do?
We don't really, it's one of the things for my role that I don't really see as our role. It's one of the beauties of a power purchase agreement is that's really for our developer to sort out. What we've heard is that it's a handful of neighbors that maybe have a sight line that they're not happy with, and our developer has been working with them to sort of satisfy those concerns. I don't really think there's going to be any substantive problem. I think what the city can do is be thoughtful about how, what kind of reputation and what sort of entity it's contracting with, and making sure that it's a company that's got a good reputation in this space and has experience kind of working with landowners and making sure folks are comfortable with the project. I should say for the vocal, person or so that I've heard that might have issue, it's really very minor compared to the vast amount of folks that are seeing, okay, this is an increase in taxes, this is job opportunities, this is some business diversification, and if they're a landowner, it's also a payment for them on a reoccurring basis that helps them maybe kind of maintain their land.
Excellent, makes sense. So another question from the audience, what new technologies excite you the most, and how will they change the business case for solar, and when?
Storage. Yeah. I mean, that's what's good. Obviously, and when you think about earlier the e-mobility conversation and talking about where that generation is coming from and the time of use rates, I mean, obviously utilities are looking at those and how to adjust those and potential rate case filings for addressing time of use as we start to see more solar capacity. Storage is going to play a big role in that.
Yeah, I would say just when we get to time of use rates, Duquesne right now in the Duquesne zone has a very flat demand curve. Actually, you can check it out on the PJM app. It's totally cool. So there's the nerd recommendation for the day. And so we do not have those kind of issues here in this service territory, but it is, I think, storage, when you're talking about purchasing all of your power from solar, Emily talked about the combined products, right? That's what you need currently in order for that to work on the PJM. But storage would really alleviate the need to have other options in that combined product.
I agree, storage. I'm also really excited about the integration of renewables. So an example would be Wheat Ridge. We just contracted the first trifecta. So it's wind, solar, and storage at one site.
Interesting.
And then probably on a little nerdier side, there is one called a bifacial technology. And so basically, it's interesting, if you go back to storage, the actual storage technology hasn't changed a ton. It's just really about, at this point in time, we're growing the amount of people that are using those batteries, and therefore we're getting some real economies of scale, and we're driving down some of the pricing there. We're also using it in different ways, right? So we're using it in electric vehicles. We're now using it for frequency regulation in the markets. So they're very different than, the traditional backup storage. But on the PV side, we haven't had a ton of technology change until recently, which is a pretty simple technology, frankly. It's called bifacial because it's literally using both faces of the panel. So with that, you're getting more efficiency. And that's really great in regions that you can pick up a pretty big yield uplift, or you can get more energy out of the same amount of panels, which is really great for solar overall.
So an interesting one here. Has anyone on the panel developed on a brownfield or heard of entities developing on a brownfield? And are there policy offsets to some of the cleanup costs?
Yeah, we have 7 of them, 7 brownfields that we're currently contracting with. So I can't speak at length to what those negotiations look like, but each one of the sites have varying different environmental constraints, and so each site has because it has a different issue. We take different approaches to it, and so therefore the costs are different. The important part is that it's underutilized land in areas of the city that have not been used for a long period of time, and now they will have a use specific to those communities. And the overall goal for the city is not just to develop the grid scale, but to create some, a social component of the project, to create jobs and for those local residents, and then also to provide power, renewable, clean energy to low-income residents at 50% less than what they're currently paying today. It's a lofty goal, but we're working with a partner that we think that we're going to be able to achieve it.
Yeah, I'd say, I haven't talked a bit about who we are, but LightSource BP is LightSource BP. And so BP actually has a lot of remediation sites that we are working closely with them on. And it's really about cost and risk. And so it will cost a bit more to develop on a brownfield because you frankly have to worry about penetrating that brownfield. So is there anything below there that you put at risk? There's a lot more regulation that you have to be really cognizant of and careful with. And then on the risk side, who bears that risk if something goes wrong? Or if, later on some issue has been identified that was, created 100, 200 years ago, but now who's accountable for that? So I think it's a really great idea to use land that really can't be used for anything else. Solar just sits there and it's actually, doesn't really do much. And so it's actually a pretty good use of the land, but it's really about, are people willing to pay? If you're comparing it to a greenfield asset, it's going to be higher cost and it's going to be more complex to develop, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And it also doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be both. Chanel was mentioning maybe you do something in the city and then maybe you do something outside. I think that's really the way to think about it. It's not one or the other. It's about how do you do it and blend it to get the benefits of both.
Great. Thank you very much. We're out of time, but I want to ask everybody to thank what's been a really super panel.